Welcome back to Nothing Without Us, a disability advocacy podcast produced by Lakeshore Foundation. I'm your host, Allie B. Gorey, and today we have a very special guest on the show. Miceala Connery is the co-founder and CEO of The Kelsey, a national nonprofit pioneering disability-forward housing solutions that are affordable, accessible, and inclusive. She launched this work alongside her cousin and co-founder, Kelsey, a passionate advocate for access and inclusion who's lived with multiple disabilities. Their shared vision continues to shape the organization's mission, vision, and impact. Since founding the Kelsey in 2018, Micaela has led the organization to develop over 200 disability-forward homes, unlock nearly $190 million for inclusive housing, and scale its influence to reach thousands of advocates and homes nationwide. As a fellow at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, she published leading national research on housing and disability, laying the groundwork for the Kelsey's model. Her commitment to inclusion began early as the founder of Unified Theater, which she launched at age 15 and scaled to schools across the country. Micaela is recognized as an Ashoka Fellow, Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation Entrepreneur, and Harvard Social Innovation and Change Initiative Fellow. Wow. A graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School and the University of Virginia, she is a sought-after voice on inclusive design, housing innovation, and community-based living. Through the Kelsey, she's advancing a bold vision: communities where people of all abilities and incomes live side by side with dignity, equity, and belonging. Micaela, thank you so much for joining us today. I am so thrilled that you're our first guest who is from out of town on this podcast, hopefully the first of many, but we're so excited you're here.
Yeah, well, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me. And while I would love to be at the incredible Lakeshore in person, I'm really excited to share from here in San Francisco.
Well, I can't wait to hear about your ties to Birmingham and all you're bringing to this city later on in the podcast. But for now, I want to get to know, and I want our audiences to get to know who Micaela is. Tell me about your origin story, both as an advocate and as someone doing the incredible work you're doing at the Kelsey.
Yeah, happy to share that. And, for me, disability advocacy, really began on a personal level with my cousin Kelsey, who I grew up with. We were born 3 months apart and, dear friends and co-conspirators in life, and kind of went through every life milestone together, and, had such a profound impact on how I see the world. And so disability and access and inclusion was just sort of always a part of my life and my identity. But it wasn't until I was in high school that I actually started to wrap my head around what my role as an advocate and an ally looked like and what that meant for me. I remember joining a sports program my freshman year in high school, a swimming program, and I showed up at the pool and I was assigned to be a partner and helper to a classmate with Down syndrome who I knew for a fact was an incredible medal winning swimmer, and I sink in a pool. And so I think that just really formed my understanding of how do I, obviously that wasn't an advocacy focused space, but it really did, give me pause and make me think about what is my role as an ally for disability access and disability inclusion in a way that also rejected what I think are still entrenched and longstanding systems of ableism and paternalism and hierarchy that just have, frankly, no space in the movement. And so I, from that moment, I feel stepped into what does it mean to co-lead around disability rights and advocacy with people with and without disabilities. What does it mean to show up to a space that I care deeply, deeply about, but also recognize that I do this work in partnership with people with lived experience with disability, and taking cues from and understanding what the movement requires and what the future we need to co-create are together. So that was as a freshman, and I think it still really defines how I show up in the movement, which now is focused on housing, but still has some of those same principles.
Oh, absolutely. And I love that you talk about co-creating. I think that is so true in any advocacy work. And I want to know sort of about your earliest years co-creating. You said you and Kelsey were co-conspirators in a way. How did maybe even your experience in that swimming program fuel some of your relationship with Kelsey moving forward?
Yeah. So like I said, Kelsey and I kind of went through every life milestone together. And what I think I continually understood as a young person with Kelsey was that Kelsey lived with, significant, as would be defined, disabilities and support needs. She used a wheelchair and used modified sign language to communicate and used 24-hour care and also had medical support needs. And even with that, I, very clearly both understood and believed and saw that like Kelsey's disabilities weren't the barrier to her full participation in communities. The way programs and systems and places were designed were the barrier. And I watched from a young age, Kelsey and her family and my aunt and my uncle and Kelsey's sisters, alongside Kelsey, really advocate for how those spaces and places could be redesigned and changed to support not just Kelsey's access, but also open doors for broader disability and access and inclusion long term. And so, that looked like, Kelsey didn't have inclusive summer camps to go to. So first we went together to an inclusive summer camp. And then her mom ended up founding a summer camp that still exists to this day for people with and without disabilities. Kelsey couldn't sit, in church because there was literally no accessible seating in this old historic church in Rhode Island, except for sitting in the very, very way back of the church. And so they, worked with the church to cut out some pews, and there's now accessible seating in this church right up in the center areas on both sides where Kelsey could sit. And now other people with disabilities sit for church every weekend. And so it was just constantly seeing that, it was a choice to have spaces be accessible or inclusive. And it was just helping people understand how to make that choice and then the steps to do that. And Kelsey was just such a pioneer along with her family and making that the reality.
I love hearing about all of those ways that her family and you were able to show up and make the choice. I always say when talking about disability inclusion, especially for folks who might be non disabled, is once you know, you can't unknow, right? Once you see how something works and changes and benefits everybody, you can't just pretend like you didn't learn that information. So, how did learning that information for you, and again, growing up with Kelsey and your family and all the experiences you've had, fuel your education down the road?
Yeah, so I think that, to those stories and in all the ways that Kelsey, in her advocacy and her family with her and her community were able to open new spaces, they hit so many barriers when it came to housing. And it was, it felt like the one space where they like couldn't create something totally new with their vision of what they wanted. And Kelsey did have an incredible home with wonderful roommates who she adored, who she lived in through the end of her life. But her family was not able to kind of break through the barriers of building integrated and inclusive and accessible housing at the level that they, envisioned. And I think that fueled my educational approach, which was we really, if we as disability rights advocates want to build an inclusive housing future, we need to step into with a lot of knowledge the design, the financing, the policies, the systems that define who and how and where we create housing in this country, and be able to break through the existing structures to make them be more disability forward. And so for me, education was part of that transition where I was like, I am literally going to grad school to focus on housing and disability, and I want to understand both, the spreadsheets and the pro formas and the financial models and the policies and the, government agencies and the existing systems and the laws and the, built environment and the design, so that I could have enough knowledge of like where the system was now so that we could break it to make it where we wanted the system to be in the future. And I'd say that our team at the Kelsey still operates with that same kind of fuel of how can we become experts in the status quo so that we can redefine that and build something better and something different that is a more disability forward model. But you can't really build something without kind of knowing what you're coming out of and building from.
Yes, you've got to learn the rules so you can break the rules, right?
I love that. Yeah, exactly.
I love it. That's what they teach us in theater and dance education, which is where I'm coming from for most
Yeah,
things. And I know that you are a former thespian as well,
I am
so
a theater kid at heart for sure.
I love it so much. Well, I want to hear about when you first had the idea for the Kelsey. What sparked that idea, and how did you turn your vision into action? Because I believe that's where a lot of advocates can get stuck is we have this grand vision and this world that we want to see. And how did you activate your vision?
Yeah, so, around just sort of when that vision came to be, I had seen Kelsey and her family, as I said, struggle around this housing options and opportunities. And at the same time, I was running an inclusive school-based program called Unified Theater that built inclusive arts programs that were co-led by students with and without disabilities in middle high schools and colleges. And I got invited by a bunch of Unified Theater participants and alumni and their family to a hearing at the Connecticut State Capitol where most of our work was happening at the time. And the hearing was all about the dearth and, cliff of housing and community inclusion opportunities that the young people who were doing our programs as students faced when they graduated out of the school system. And so for me, it was like I'm operating in inclusive education programs with a theory of change that we're supporting young people with without disabilities to move on to inclusive adulthood. And that inclusive adulthood literally does not exist. And so that
Mm,
was, like I said, my focus for, making this transition from theater kid to housing developer, which is quite a jump. And
right.
I think part of that transition too, besides, the education piece that I spoke at and really wanting to understand everything I could about what the existing models were. I published a paper for the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard on disability forward, what's working, what's happening, and what's needed to really just understand, what was there. And I would say, sort of a reluctant founder. My goal was actually to go work for a public agency, a housing developer, a funder who was doing this already, and go work for them and help them do this more. And unfortunately, came to realize that didn't exist. And after literally a year of trying to sort of slot disability forward housing into a number of other organizations and initiatives, and have like, I'll come work for you, but I'll like focus on disability forward housing, and realize like that just doesn't exist. Myself and with encouragement from mentors, decided to ultimately launch the Kelsey as its own organization. And so it was, a combination of seeing the need really clearly, understanding the field and the gap we were filling in the field, and then coming up with a model too that realized also how to do both. We need to build housing that meets immediate needs and demonstrate what works and can be scaled to communities across the country, like Birmingham. And we need to connect that with systems change and policy work to be able to make this possible everywhere, so that the Kelsey is not just the only person doing this, but we have a model that can be, brought to any community anywhere through policy change, through field leadership, and through open source resources, so that what we do can really serve the 61 million people who have disabilities in this country and who are facing kind of pretty intense housing barriers.
Where was your first location and what was it like to open it?
Yeah. So our first community has been open for just over a year in San Jose, California. And actually, our second community has been open for since April here in San Francisco. I'm actually sitting upstairs in one of our community rooms at the Kelsey Civic Center in San Francisco. And it's pretty incredible to go from, as some people in the housing industry call it, like dirt to keys. For us to have these two pieces of land where, 5 years ago it was literally like nothing, or like a small office building in an empty parking lot, or an under like an old, defunct community garden. Actually, fun fact is that the Kelsey Civic Center is actually at the former location. They now have a beautiful site on Market Street, but the former location years and years ago of Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco. So
Oh,
our site
wow.
Yeah, so our site has a really powerful history of disability in a lot of different ways, and that's one of them. But yeah, I think it's just remarkable, with all the community organizing and advocacy, the community workshops to hear from people with disabilities and their community around what this housing development should include, to work with policymakers on actually getting the funding and the structures to build this, to have people actually calling it home. Is pretty incredible, and also like takes a village. Like we're planning to celebrate housewarming here at the Kelsey Civic Center in a few next month actually, and just like going through the list of all the people who are going to be invited to this celebration of this community being we're at almost 100% occupancy. Like it's a lot of people who are a part of making one of these developments possible, and I think of our work, that's just in its early stages in Birmingham in the same way. Like it's incredible all the different people who touch disability forward housing and housing in general, who now get to celebrate, 150 plus residents calling something home that formerly literally didn't exist, but now does, and is pretty incredible.
That's got to be the best feeling. I can only imagine what it's going to feel like once you're in Birmingham. I'm so excited.
Yeah.
I'm really, really curious about for people that are just getting to know you, right? I've gotten to learn about your work, but maybe folks on the podcast are just hearing about the Kelsey for the first time. Talk to us about the way you design your buildings and your communities and what that looks like and what design features that might include and the people that are there every day making it happen.
Yeah. So we take a focus on the Kelsey to build what we consider cross disability accessible design. So, really looking at the built environment for supporting people with all different types of disabilities and the access needs that those come with. And looking at that when we think about inclusive design, too, obviously that includes the physical, the doors and the elevators, and I'll talk about some of those specific features, but I'd also note to folks that inclusive design also, as one of our partners in our inclusive design standards, Eric Micaela always says, you can't have an inclusive outcome without an inclusive process. That inclusive design actually starts from who's at the table for how you conceive of the building and what you think of and what the spaces should include, and who's asked for input. And so for us, inclusive design actually starts with inclusive community engagement, where we do community workshops with people with disabilities. We form a community advisory group that includes people with and without disabilities who are local to the area and who understand the different elements of what we're trying to create, to really hear from folks about what design features and building elements we should include. And all of that is both realized in our buildings, but also captured through a resource that we co-created called the Inclusive Design Standards, as I shared with Eric Micatin and a National Inclusive Design Council. The Inclusive Design Standards are a set of guidelines from the design and development process through the physical elements of the building, all the way into the operations and amenities that are part of what the building includes when it's open, and defines a set of over 300 elements, choices, as we talked about, and items that you include within the process or the building or the operations that support cross disability accessibility. And those can look like everything from, I'm just looking out into our hallway, to wayfinding is a big thing we do, which is how people navigate through a building. So our buildings include alternative wayfinding supports for people with cognitive disabilities who might not read or have memory challenges, where our floors are color coded and have symbols so that people know where they are without having to remember I'm on the second floor. It includes acoustic wayfinding, where we have felting on the walls in front of the elevator corridor so people can hear auditorily when they're in front of the elevators, that's repeated on every floor, that allows them to know without seeing, I'm in this different part of the building, this is where the elevator is going to be found, and I can push it and go where I want to go. It includes features like having 2-bedroom units so that people who live with live-in caregivers can have 2 separate bedrooms for them and a caregiver to live, because many of our residents do live with 24-hour care, not to mention folks who live with roommates and families. It includes things like biophilic design, which is like natural materials and access to green spaces that supports both physical and emotional health, so that we think about our materials and our color selection designs to keep spaces that are calm and also spaces that we don't use, certain materials that support chemical sensitivity. So as I start to rattle it off, there are just hundreds of individual choices that we make in our building design that support people, whether they have mobility disabilities, physical, sensory disabilities, cognitive disabilities, health and wellness considerations, support needs. There's tons of other pieces. The last thing I'll just say on it is that all of our units are actually designed with the same level of accessibility, with a minor switch of roll-in showers versus regular. But other than that, our units are exactly the same, so that our units support both anybody with diverse access needs can move into those units. It helps with unit turnover. It allows you to have a neighbor with disabilities visit your unit, even if you weren't, needing those accessibility features. And so that includes, universally accessible counter heights and grab bar ability to install them, and removing under counter for wheelchair roll under. So there's just so many, again, choices that we support, and all of those come back to what we heard from disabled people themselves of what should be and would be important features to include.
I love that you continue to say the word choice, because if that's one thing I hope our listeners take, they're going to take a lot from this episode, but that all of these things are choices, and they might have heard some things in your design standards that they've never considered before, and that they could make a different choice when designing their next community space. So
Yeah.
I love hearing that and that focus. I'm curious, when you're coming to a new city, right? And you're bringing the Kelsey across the country. I'm so excited that it's coming here to Birmingham. But I know what you've done because I've gotten to sit in some meetings with you. But what is your process when wanting to bring your work to a new place?
Yeah. So the first thing we do is, at some level, we don't just show up in a new place, but we are invited to a new community. So it starts with, a local champion, or in most cases, a group of local champions who say, we recognize a need for disability forward housing in this community. And we'd like the Kelsey to help us address this need. And so we had that happen in Birmingham, and that's happening for us in other communities as we consider, though Birmingham is our first community outside of California. So we're thrilled to call it a future home. And so, yeah, it starts with being invited in. Then we begin with, as I shared, both a needs analysis and community engagement work. And that's really driven for two things. One is, like, we don't want to recreate the wheel. If we're invited into a city and we actually learn that somebody's already doing this and somebody's already, like, working towards this, we'd much rather share our resources and help them continue to do what they're doing than try to, start something that duplicates local efforts. And so we really do a hard look at, like, is our model really needed? And then we're also looking at, like, do we have the right partners potentially in place to make this successful here? And so in Birmingham, that was over a year of work of just community workshops and engagement and needs assessments and feedback sessions with people both in, disability spaces and social services and city government and housing development and construction and design, to really assess how we would step in. And then from that, that helps us actually then, coming out of that, define our project team, because we do this work in partnership with, local developers, service providers, city government, and advocacy orgs. And so we've built together a team. We're co-developing in Birmingham with an organization called Gulf Coast Housing Partnership. We've built close partnership with our representation in city government, Councilmember O'Quinn and the mayor's office, and particularly the office that handles housing and community development, and different service organizations. Many that were actually right down the street from Workshops Empowerment and United Ability we've gotten to know. So all those organizations who our residents will eventually, come from or benefit from services from. And so, yeah, it's a lot of building that both project team and then broader community support team around it. We also do a lot of fundraising, which we're continuing to do, because, the Kelsey both raises public dollars for these projects, which the bulk of our project is funded through tax credits and local, state, and federal subsidies. But we use philanthropic dollars to get our projects going, to take risks as this is coming together and acquire the land and move the project forward. And so we've raised and will be continuing to raise those philanthropic dollars. We've already put over $1 million of philanthropic funding that we've, put from the Kelseys raised into acquiring the land and moving the project forward. forward. And now we're in the stage of, putting the financing together for the full project, as well as finalizing all that design and development. So it's a process, and as I noted on this project, it takes a village, and it's incredible, all the different people who touch this development stage.
I love hearing about this because it goes to show just how important really building community is and making sure a project like this takes off. And I also really commend you for the way you mentioned true partnerships and collaborations and not trying to reinvent the wheel. I think sometimes in advocacy work, we can get so hungry to make the change we want to make that we don't see some of the good work already being done in our community and partner up. And I think that's so, so important. And I love that you are both partnering and creating something that we don't quite have yet, at least in this city. So that's just really beautiful to hear. And I think really important for folks to hear, because sometimes you just want to go with your new idea, right? And your data-driven research and ability to really get to know the communities you seek to serve for a significant amount of time before jumping in is so important.
Yeah. And I think it's cool to think about too, like, our goal is to be both scalable nationally, but deeply place-based. So certain things like our inclusive design, that's going to be pretty universal. Like that should be replicated anywhere. But like the Kelsey Civic Center and the Kelsey Air Station here in California are even themselves very different communities if you visit them. And the Kelsey Avondale will also be very different because it reflects both the city of Birmingham, the neighborhood of Avondale, and what even the state of Alabama at some level. It's just different. And so we can build something that is replicable and universally, supportive of people with different disabilities and be inclusive, while also being really resonant to what the local community needs and what the specifics are there.
I love it so much. As we've been talking, I've heard you use the term disability forward, which I love and I know from learning from you. But how could you describe disability forward to someone who's hearing that for the first time?
Yeah, so disability forward is a term that we kind of coined at the Kelsey and use all the time, and love now that others are using it to describe their work as well. And what to us disability forward means is anchoring on the overlooked and unmet needs of people with disabilities. And in doing so, recognizing that that opens doors to opportunities and, better experiences for everyone. And so in disability forward housing, that means that anchoring on the overlooked and unmet housing needs of people with disabilities actually just creates better housing opportunities, increased housing access, and better communities for everyone. But it's doing so with anchoring on that those particular needs of people with disabilities. And so that defines everything that we do at the Kelsey, and I think actually could define everything we should do in the world. So we really value that.
One disability forward thing that I think you're doing, well, you're always doing disability and forward things, but one that really stood out to me when you were describing the Kelsey to me for the first time is talking about, yes, your design features, yes, your locations, but also at your buildings, you have folks that are inclusion concierge. What is the role of those folks in your communities, and how is that scalable, and what does it look like in different cities, or is it similar?
Yeah. So first of all, like all good ideas at the Kelsey, the inclusion concierge came from hearing from disabled advocates and people with disabilities, and particularly folks who lived in housing but also had some level of support or service needs. That folks said, I want to live in housing where I don't have to like be prescribed this like one specific service, because I might want to work with a different agency or my service needs might change, and I want those to be independent of my housing. Yet I do want someone linked to my housing who understands my service needs, who can help connect me to services, and also can be a part of connecting me to the broader community. And so the inclusion concierge really came out of that idea. The term concierge was not accidental. Concierge is really about being person-centered, a culture of hospitality and intentionality to what we do. And so the concierge really is that. There's somebody who supports to connect residents to services and supports they need, to their neighbors in their community, and to the broader city and community that they live in. And support also in that sort of housing access and housing navigation and housing retention. And so there are spin on, a lot of housing will have residents resident services, and this is our model of resident services. We operate with 2 inclusion concierge in each of our existing communities, and we are budgeting for inclusion concierge for the Kelsey Avondale. And yes, we are, goal is to replicate the inclusion concierge. And what's really cool about it is that the Kelsey can operate inclusion concierge ourselves, that, we manage and hire and run that program. But we've also kind of codified the resources and the guidelines and the operating principles and all the manuals and the stuff of what it means to be an inclusion concierge and how to operate it so that other people can actually take on the inclusion concierge themselves. We have a project that's opening on the East Coast right now that's using our inclusion concierge to inform their resident services, for the new disability forward building that's opening. So we are excited to scale this both in our own developments where we run and operate inclusion concierge, but actually it's up for grabs, so folks can reach out to the Kelsey, and we'd love to share the inclusion concierge model to become a more, available approach within other disability forward and inclusive affordable housing elsewhere.
That's so important because you're also saying, hey, this is something we've done so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like you've helped us
Yeah.
in some communities and now we can help you. I love it so much.
Yeah, and that's like the
Before
design
we,
standards too. Sorry,
oh
Allie.
no, keep going.
Yeah, I
No,
was
keep
just
going.
saying, so much of what we do is, open sourcing our, what we learn. So we have a whole section of our website called the Learn Center, where all of this is, fair game for folks to take on. And there's, dozens of resources in there because we want to, not be the only ones doing this. We want to, share it out so that other people can lead the way too.
Well, and continue a movement, it sounds like to me, which is just so exciting.
Yeah.
Before we wrap today, I really want to hear your dreams and thoughts for the future of the Kelsey. And maybe that means sharing where are you going to pop up next? Where are the next buildings going to be? But also, this can be as grand or visionary as you like. So take that with what you will.
Yeah. So, we, as an organization, are working towards a vision of 20,000 homes by 2030, 20,000 disability forward homes that we either create, assist, or enable at the Kelsey. So, we are very laser focused on that piece of how do we make housing opportunity more abundant in communities everywhere, not just through our own housing pipeline, but through our technical assistance and also through our advocacy. And so, when I think about, what will, the world look like 5 years from now in 2030 for the Kelsey, our hope is that we have Kelsey communities, our target is 6 communities by 2030, that we are, have operating across the country, but that we are a maybe best in class, but a one in class of other people doing disability forward housing that, we're really good at running the inclusion concierge, but there's inclusion concierge in many buildings, and that there's the policies and the programs in place, that 811, the key federal program that supports disability inclusive housing in this country that we're using in Birmingham and already used in our California projects, that federal program is expanded and shared out and provided into more communities, that, our housing finance systems don't look at disability as a compliance check mark or a, issue to work around, but as a core population to include in their development priorities and policies and programs, and that disability forward housing is not seen as something niche or special, but just a practice that all housing should really include. Because if 1 in 4 people in this country live with a disability, 1 in 4 residents in any housing community ideally live with a disability. And so we hope that 5 years from now we'll be able to point to those 20,000 homes that we've developed and supported and made possible as part of a really robust field of disability forward housing that's available really everywhere.
I love it so much. And I'm so excited for our listeners to be learning about your work because you may have some potential new community partners in other cities across the country. And with that, I'm curious if people are hearing about the Kelsey for the first time and they want to get involved or they want to reach out, what is the best way to do that?
Yeah, so thekelsey.org is our website, and there's a couple different ways you can plug in. There's a section of our website if you're looking for technical assistance, you can contact us for starting projects. There's a section of our website about advocacy to join our different coalitions, sign on to support letters. There's a support letter right now, for example, around 8/11, so there's ways on our website to plug into those different advocacy actions. And then I'd be remiss to not say that there's also a way to support us as a donor, which is really critical. Being able to go into Birmingham, we've raised, just under 500,000 locally for funding from Birmingham, but actually we've also put dollars in Birmingham for funding that we've raised from supporters across the country. And so funding the Kelsey to support both the work that we're doing now, but also helping fund us going into new communities and bringing this opportunity to new places and people. We are deeply grateful and welcome anyone to join the movement also as a supporter in that way.
That's so important. Thank you so much for sharing. And thank you for taking time out of your very busy and important day to day running and creating these incredible communities to speak with us. We're so honored to get to chat with you.
Well, thanks, Allie B. We are, thrilled to call Birmingham a future home and excited to continue the work there and bring on, even more partners to make this possible.
Well, I can't wait to see you in Birmingham again soon.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Nothing Without Us, a disability inclusion and advocacy podcast produced by Lakeshore Foundation. We hope that if you loved the show today, you'll share this episode with a friend, family member, coworker, or colleague. The more people are hearing this mission, the better. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
Nothing Without Us, a disability advocacy podcast, is produced by Lakeshore Foundation, Allie B. Gorey, Terry Scrimshire, and me, Patrick Tomley. For more information, visit lakeshore.org.